7:32 on your Wednesday morning. Leanna, Bjorn and Josh here with you, and in studio again this week we have Tash McGill. Morena.
Morena e te whānau. It's very good to be here with you. And this morning in our political segment, we are talking about the End of Life Bill. So this is probably the biggest, most controversial and potentially most socially impacting of the decisions that you'll make as you head into the election this year. And it's one that we think definitely was worth taking some time to consider and to talk about. So as we have been doing in these segments, we're going to present to you the Conservative viewpoint, the Liberal viewpoint, and then we're going to talk about some of the challenges with this law and perhaps a way of navigating through. So first up this morning, again, our friend Bob McCoskrie is going to give us an overview of the Conservative perspective of the End of Life Bill.
I think for a Conservative viewpoint, it has always been around the sanctity of life, whether that's been for the unborn or whether it's for the elderly. So that has always been a starting point. And so legislation that basically gives a green light to kill a patient to help them commit suicide just goes against the grain. It goes against that whole sanctity of life aspect. But I think this debate goes beyond that, because I think there's a lot of confusion around what we're actually voting for. A lot of people are voting yes in this referendum because they think they're voting for the right to have a do not resuscitate order, or to discontinue life support, or to stop feeding of solids when the person can no longer take it, or it's to increase the morphine because it's part of the palliative care. People want to know that when they die, and this is what we agree with the people who do promote euthanasia, we all agree that we don't want people to die painful deaths. But the fact of the matter is that hospices and palliative care specialists will say that our palliative care has advanced so much that that doesn't have to happen. We need to make it available throughout the country, especially to rural areas, etc., so that people do have access to that kind of care. But a lot of people are voting yes because they just want to know that they're going to have those end-of-life choices. Now, that's a bit that bugs me about the referendum, because we're not asked, do you support or oppose euthanasia? We're being asked, do you support end-of-life choice? And a Conservative and a Liberal supports end-of-life choice. We want that end-of-life choice. The Conservative viewpoint is that we already have that choice. It's already legal to make those choices, like to discontinue life support or to increase the morphine to deal with the pain, which may have the unintended effect of ending life sooner. So, there's been a bit of a smokescreen and confusion around what we're actually voting for. When people understand that we can make those end-of-life choices, then they say, okay, we obviously don't need assisted suicide or euthanasia. That's the first aspect. The second aspect that I think we really need to think about is, and this is where I think both Conservatives and Liberals would be on the same page, is that the reason we don't have the death penalty in New Zealand is because there was always the concern, what if we got one wrong? Now, that's the same question we need to ask ourselves as we head to this referendum. How many euthanasia mistakes are we willing to accept? For example, what if we got the prognosis wrong and actually they weren't going to die within 6 months? They actually lived another 8 or 9 years, which is quite possible. What if the diagnosis was wrong? What if the patient was just depressed and actually wanted to live those final days enjoying family, but just felt like they were a burden, or they were just scared? What if they were under pressure from a greedy family who wanted to, literally knock them off earlier for the inheritance money? And unfortunately, we know elder abuse is a problem. So, even if people are thinking about maybe they should vote yes, a really important question, how many mistakes are we willing to allow? Because unfortunately, with euthanasia, there's no undoing what we've done. You can't undo death. And for the same reason we don't have the death penalty, I don't think we should have euthanasia. It's just too risky, and it's too risky for vulnerable people.
Great work there, Tash, and really interesting to hear Bob's views. And I thought it was interesting that he said that as a Conservative kind of person, his opinion, he kind of agrees with Liberals in that having the choices at the end of life is important, but that he believes that we kind of already have that, and that, this law is going too far.
So what he's really talking about is the challenge that we have in there's already some accepted practice going on in our medical communities and in our hospice communities. It's not legal, right? But it's an accepted practice that as people move towards the end of life, you might offer them more morphine, and as Bob talked about, that's making them comfortable, but it can also sometimes speed up the process. And look, this is a really personal one for me. I lost my stepdad last year after a really long struggle with a degenerative disease, and anybody who's known or been close to anybody who's really suffered towards the end of life can see the spaces where we need compassion in the way that we view this. And also compassion for the people who might, be otherwise victimised or prosecuted if they're seen to be, mismanaging end-of-life care.
One of the things I noticed when I was watching some of the debates about this in Parliament was that very fact that a lot of the politicians were sharing their own stories, and everybody, well, not everybody, but a lot of people have a experience in some way with this kind of thing, with someone that they knew. And there's a lot of emotion obviously attached to that, and you can see some of the speeches if you go watch them. People were very close and what they went through. But that does make it hard though, right? When we start looking at things, and I don't mean to minimize anyone's experience by saying anecdotally, but when you take one experience that you saw and then that forms your entire view on a legal document is quite a cloudy thing, right? So trying to at the same time vote off the things you have experienced in life, but also look at I don't want to say bigger picture, but in a way, it's a really hard thing, right?
So this is where we get into this question of what is risky lawmaking, and how do we measure and navigate our way through that? So it's probably a good time to switch to perhaps a more liberal perspective. And we're going to talk to Rob Kilpatrick, who is a former director of the Baptist Mission Society, or Transend. He's worked in third world countries. He's very committed to a lot of issues that are actually about sustainable and thriving communities. And so I spoke with him about his perspective on this bill and which way he's thinking about voting. And I think it may surprise you to hear the tension that he's wrestling with. So let's hear what he had to say.
Let's come to a theological perspective. Right. Theological perspective is God is in charge of life. And I think that if you start screwing with life in any direction, and I mean abortion, I mean capital punishment, war, whatever. Whenever you start doing that, you are going against a God who affirms love, life, justice, peace, shalom. So it's dangerous to fiddle with this stuff, right? But we have to recognize that our technology has probably outstripped some of our older ethical guidelines. And the reality is, I don't like the way in which I'm being forced to vote, because I don't think that this legislation is actually the solution. I think it would be much better if we put a lot more energy into hospices and stuff like that, and a lot more money, and we had a kind of almost Irish approach to end of life, where people sit around and they talk with the person and they cradle them in their death. So but that assumes that there's a close-knit community and all sorts of other things, and that's just not true of New Zealand society anymore for a lot of people. And so consequently, I think I still lean in favour of the legislation with the hope that we will actually pull it back in 3 years' time, because I think it's too loose. I think there are far too many decisions that might be made by people under pressure. It's not that helpful, but it does get us talking about the issue of human dignity, of life and its purpose, of community, of how we face death, and how we take people through that process. And I think that we really do need to rethink some of this, and it's time that we did. And our technology is forcing this upon us, and so we need to take square account of the fact God affirms life, but there is certainly, in my opinion, a point at which you must say it is kinder and more compassionate to end this person's life here and now. That is the kind thing to do. Now, yeah, and I can say that as somebody who sat with a whole number of dying people, and one or two who have died in discomfort, shall we say, despite all the drugs and everything else. So that's, I think, where we need to go. We can be compassionate. We certainly need to put more protection around it. You see, one of the problems with it is that it now gives a mixed message to young people, because we are saying suicide is bad. Our youth suicide statistics are appalling. This kind of death is okay. This kind of suicide is okay. I don't think that's a good message to give to young people. But I'm willing to take that risk on the basis that we will improve the legislation in 3 years' time.
Very interesting to hear the conflict that he's wrestling with there, and the tension, like you mentioned, of these two ideas. And interesting what he said about that he wants to, he is in favour of it, but in the hopes that it will be sort of refined in a few years' time. That's an interesting thought, because a lot of people do worry about, the other direction, like the slippery slope, as people say, the degradation of the legislation. So that's an interesting point that you've looked into, right, Tash?
Yeah. So as a nation, we have a reasonable track record of amending laws when they're not working for us. So we've actually been through, and they tend to be the things that are called the Reform Acts. I'm not going to name too many of them because that'd spark a whole other set of controversies. But we do have this tendency to look at laws to see whether or not they're working and adjust them and amend them. And so people have highlighted a number of what they consider to be issues or concerns with this particular bill. But this is a binding referendum. So if it goes through, the work's already been done. It's gone through its readings in Parliament. It's gone through the process of creating law. So if we say yes, and it becomes the law, we'll potentially have an opportunity to look at reforming it, to look at amending it in the future. That will require people in Parliament who continue to sort of take on that challenge of refining the law. Right. But it is a really important consideration. There's a reason we vote people into Parliament, and it's usually because we trust them to make the big decisions for us. So this election, they've kicked not one but two big decisions back to the people to say, we're not sure about making this one, guys. Why don't you tell us what you think?
I'm quite a fan of referendums. I quite like them. So it's interesting that there's two in this election. Now, we're covering a lot of the topics. We're going to be doing this twice a week leading up to the election with Tash. We've got all kinds of stuff coming up. We've got tax and what else are we covering over the next wee while? Economy, transport.
Transport, big
housing.
One. Immigration.
Let's guess. Now probably covered most of them there. We did cannabis on Monday, and then, we talked about cannabis on Monday. There's an audio clip for anyone who needs it. We talked about the
That's
cannabis.
the end of my career in a 2-second clip.
We talked about the cannabis referendum on Monday, and
go.
Today is the end of life choice bill. If you want to hear the chat from Monday, it is on the websites, rema.co.nz and lifefm.co.nz. Tash just brought us two clips from both ends of the spectrum. We had Bob McCoskrie on. He was talking about kind of the conservative view, and he made some really interesting points, talking about the reason we don't have the death penalty, sort of being along the lines of, what if we got one wrong, and kind of the same or a similar situation. And then we also heard from Rob Kilpatrick, or is it Kirkpatrick? Kilpatrick. He talked about the kind of liberal side of things, and it was really interesting to hear his thoughts, because you could kind of hear his almost struggle with the whole thing. But I thought that he made some great kind of points around being kind and compassionate, and what does it mean to be kind and compassionate when someone is suffering at the end of their life. So both made some great points. It may have made you even more confused. I don't know, because both sides have great arguments,
Look, both sides do, and I think one of the pieces that's really fascinating in this particular conversation is that both the conservative and the liberal viewpoints are wrestling with the same thing, which is what is the right amount of regulation and protection to put around how we care for people and how we offer compassion in our medical and end-of-life treatment. But at the same time, they're both recognising that for that law to work effectively, there actually maybe need to be some fundamental changes in New Zealand society, in the way that we are compassionate and kind towards one another, in the way that we surround people, in the way that we make sure that people aren't left hanging out, at the end of life or at the end of depression, or if they're struggling with suicide, feeling like they don't have any other choice but to take advantage of the end of life bill if it should pass. And so that then becomes a really big communal responsibility. And you might argue that actually that's part of the reason why it's good that this has come to a public referendum, because it's forcing us all to consider who do we need to be and what kind of compassionate communities do we need to live in order to make sure that this law and these set of regulations are not abused, that they can't be taken advantage of.
So both these guys address that idea of community, which I think is quite interesting. And do you think that we need to change as a society in terms of the amount of community that we have, or the way we do kind of, I guess, hang out?
I think that we have made some incredible strides. Like, if I was to consider in the last 10 years how the conversation about men's mental health has changed, the way that the conversation around mental health in general has changed, I think a lot of those things we've really made strides in. But actually, have we begun to talk differently about death? I don't think so. I do think that there is a further place that we can get to become a more compassionate, a more caring, a more other-centered kind of community. To help kind of, I really enjoyed what Rob said about taking a more Irish style, which I think he's really talking about kind of the Celtic approach to wakes and what have you. Which is he used the word cradling, that we would cradle people in their death, and I think that's probably something we need to consider. For a third perspective or a new kind of posture on this, we spoke to, again, our friend Frank Ritchie. We won't hear from him every week, but on this particular subject, he dived into his own experience and then talked about this idea of community a little bit further, and presenting kind of the posture that we might need to take as a Christian community, as Christians individually, to consider as we vote towards this issue.
I'll use abortion because a lot of people are linking abortion and euthanasia. My inclination is towards life, but I have sat with people who have made the decision to abort, and it has been a gut-wrenching, horrible journey for them. And I have sat with them in that process, not given my view, but just said, look, you're going through this, and I believe in the God who dwells with you through this, and so I will be with you through this. I think that pastoral inclination needs to be front and center more than our political inclination, because that's where Jesus would be. He'd be in the mess, no matter how good or bad or right or wrong the situation might seem. So I think we need to bring that into the euthanasia discussion as well. Even if we disagree with someone, could we sit with someone in the middle of their suffering? And then no matter what the law does on anything, because politics is only one part of society, the government and the laws it makes are only one part of society. The challenge is on for us as Christian communities. No matter what the law says, what are we doing with people? Are we providing intimacy? Are we wrapping around people in their suffering? Are we making sure that nobody ever feels alone? I would hazard a guess, because I know it's true of my church, that the individualism of our wider culture is well and truly rife in our church cultures as well. I've got people in my church who I know always feel nervous about sharing their vulnerabilities and their struggles because they don't want others to see it. That's a really sad indictment on the church. So no matter what the law says, our response to human suffering and the challenge that something like euthanasia poses is that we should be providing intimate community better than anybody else does.
Reverend Frank Ritchie with his thoughts on the end of life choice bill.
So we need to be better at community than anyone else as Christians. Really some good ideas there from the Reverend Frank Ritchie, as per usual, I suppose. But sort of addressing that community issue.
I think if you were to take what the core tenets of our faith are, it's not what the law says, it's how we live out the law. And it's particularly true and relevant in this case. If the law passes, then it's how we live out that law that will make the difference and will be the demonstration of how we live as Christians in this society. If the law doesn't pass, same thing. How do we live with compassion and live out kindness and help and support to people who are suffering at the end of their life? before we go or wrap on this, I'd like to say this is the one thing that I would really encourage you to actually get online. Read the bill for yourself so that you have a crystal clear understanding of what the law is actually saying, what it allows for and what it doesn't. And the other thing I would encourage you to do is, if you're still undecided, check out some of the resources that are available online from both the pro and the against side. There's a Facebook Live coming up tonight that's being presented by Risky Law that walks through some of the issues that they find with it. But there are also plenty of other resources out there to explain why people have a positive view of what this law will mean. And good luck with your decision making.
Yeah, a bit of praying will help as well with your decision. Tash McGill, thank you so much for coming in and being our political correspondent at this time. Obviously, the election's coming up, and this is really helpful. So thank you for coming in this morning.